So yeah, when the oil prices sunk, and the U.S. went into austerity, when the U.S. banks raised their interest rates, Mexico had difficulty in getting the credit for or money for its businesses, and Mexico was in a situation by 1982 or 81 where they were defaulting, not able to pay those loans that they had taken in the late 1970s with the fall of oil prices. So it was going to default on its loan to international creditors. Um, and at that point, Mexico said, "What what can we do? We need more money. We need to borrow more money to first pay off our debts, and then we'll pay you back later. How can we do this?" And the answer came from the world financial institutions such as IMF, International Monetary Fund, and from the international investors was you are going to have to institute free market reforms. Right, free market reforms. And what that simply means is no more protectionism. And it's the end of ISI, like import substitution industrialization. It's the end of ISI. Open yourself up to international trade, and they did this in a couple of ways. First, deregulation. There is lot of there is got to be a less of a relationship between business and government. If there are businesses that the government owns that are not cost efficient, the government needs to sell those rather than to acquire more debt. If the IMF saw the situation of US Postal Service, they would say sell it. It's just costing the US taxpayers a lot of money. Let a private company do this. That would be the prescription of the IMF. And Mexico was in the same boat. They were told to sell a lot of their government owned steel mills and energy plants and things of that nature. Another thing was that they said, listen, you have got a very top heavy, overly centralized economy. You guys look a lot like those big socialist economies of China and Russia or France. You need to decentralize, you need to give more power to individual states and municipalities to avoid having this bloated, inefficient central government telling you what to do, make, or what not to make. And we got to remember that what happened as a result of this decentralization is it actually allowed some of the northern regions to start doing much better economically, which already had a close relationship with the US. Remember, those are the regions which later on started going to vote for PAN, PAN. And that was part of this result, that's of this result decentralization. Another thing they said, okay, you guys print way too much money. You need to stop controlling the amount of money by yourself. Follow the US model. Follow the German model of having a central bank that is independent, that doesn't simply print more money or make it easier to borrow money uh, so that you can be re-elected, but instead make some hard choices to keep inflation uh, under in check. And of course, the other huge step that Mexico did was to open itself up to free trade, and it did this by joining two organizations. One, the North American Free Trade Agreement, famously known as NAFTA, which brings together Mexico and Canada and the US. But it's the US that really matters because 89% of its exports were going up to the US. And likewise, Mexico joined, like I said, the GATT, the second organization, which became WTO in 1986, in a move to become more free trade, to become a more free trade. So that's the story. I want you to take a look at one of those recommended reading dealing with um, scoring free trade, which um, really focused on Mexico. It's focused on Mexico, like scoring free trade for Mexico. So the idea here is, in terms of its goal, NAFTA has been successful. It's what this article says. So again, if you are interested in Mexico, you can go back and read this, but it says that NAFTA really has been successful. It has allowed exports to the US to really increase a lot. Over 10% per year to the rest of the world. And to the rest of the world, held at 8%. So it's exporting a lot more. It's been good for US because US export to Mexico also increased by 10%. Really, it's the US trade was diverted. A lot of it went down to Mexico as opposed to 4% growth to the rest of the world. By being part of NAFTA, that encouraged again more foreign direct investment, which increased by 3 times. But a really good thing for Mexico as a result of trying to follow this prescription was for it to become less dependent on one single aspect of its economy, oil. Now, 90% of Mexico's exports are manufactured goods, whereas back in the 1980s, usually 75% of that was oil, simple oil. And again, oil can make some money, but the value of oil fluctuates a lot, and it's not good to hang your hat on a raw commodity like that. It's much better to do something manufactured which mm, you yourself are adding value to. And this has really allowed Mexico to become much more diversified economy, much healthier economy. Now, unfortunately, agriculture has not been very productive or competitive, and a lot of what NAFTA was supposed to be about want to get Mexican workers who were working in the fields in the US picking tomatoes. The idea was, well, if we take down trade barriers between the US and Mexico, we should be able to have cheaper tomatoes here in Mexico, and those workers will come back and work in farms in Mexico. Well, that didn't quite happen because although the wages were nice and low, which would lead to low cost agriculture, their way of making things is not very efficient. It's usually in small farms, and American farmers have been overly competitive, partially due to the large subsidies which um, that American farmers also get. But they have been more cost efficient because of this, and it really driven or allowed migration to continue because it really aren't the type of agriculture jobs that Mexico was hoping to get out of NAFTA. Now, another aspect of this article is saying, okay, free trade maybe it has been so successful for Mexico, but partially these are due to Mexico's policy choices. One of the big problem is that Mexico still offers tremendous tax breaks to its businesses. Only 11% of what's produced in the country gets taxed compared to, let's say, in a country like US where a third of that got taxed. Of course, that's going to be outdated now, but at least up till last year, one third of what gets made gets taxed, allowing a lot of government revenue. The Mexican government has been very poor revenue because it allows most of its businesses to go untaxed. This part also leads to a very weak education system, which can be very dangerous. One of the things that Mexico is able to do is say, well, we will be paying a lot less to workers, and that's how we'll be competitive, right? It's much better to get blue jeans made in Mexico than the US because you can pay a lot less to workers. Well, the problem is that there are other countries out there in the world who can produce the blue jeans even a lot cheaper than Mexico because their workers make even a lot less than Mexican workers. Here I am thinking of about countries like India or Vietnam. So in the long term, Mexico's future needs to be developed need to be developed and to create more well-paying jobs for people who are somewhat educated, but the education system in Mexico remains underfunded. And really, only a small group of upper middle class, and wealthy people are able to get their kids the kind of education that gets some good jobs. So, as a result of this, the Gini redistribution in Mexico is rather poor, and the Gini coefficient is 48, that is even higher than in the US. So, there is even greater income equality in the to call in the US. Despite the fact that there has been a growing middle class, I mean, there has been economic growth and it has created larger middle class, but it still isn't a very big middle class, and there is still an awful lot of poor, which is why we see a high Gini coefficient. Uh, so that's about Mexico. The final piece that I had asked you guys to read is called Latin America article, which kind of was talking a little bit about Mexico, but it was talking about Latin America as a whole. And again, Mexico should serve partially as an example of the challenges facing the entire Latin American region, right? The Central America and South America. So the question was asked in the Latin American piece was, had these market reforms failed, free market reforms failed? And the article tends to defend the free market reforms and saying no, they haven't failed. Really, what has led to a less than a stellar result in terms of growth is that they really haven't been carried out fully enough. Like corruption hasn't stamped out, there is still an awful lot of state ownership of business. There is still too much protectionism allowing inefficient businesses to exist. So, yeah, economic growth in a lot of Latin American has not been spectacular, but it's because those countries really haven't followed the rule book that they should when it comes to becoming truly free trade. And again, another aspect that this article points out as well is that there is not, if you are going to complain about Mexico not being equitable country, part of it rests with Mexican decisions itself, right? They have got the growth, but the growth is then not distributed equally, but rather unequally, so that the poor remain poor. Another part of what Latin American article focuses on is Chile. Again, Chile is a very special case because it's one of those few Latin American countries that has experienced good economic growth and not gone into debt very much. And one of the things that was able to institute is what we call capital controls. And what capital controls means is that when the foreign direct investment comes in, um, that can be a very good thing because it pumps more money into your economy, allows new businesses to form. But it's a very unpredictable way of accumulating money, and it's very unpredictable because it's suddenly. Uh, but if suddenly those foreign investor can find another place where they can make more money, they might withdraw all their money very quickly, leaving your businesses in the lurch. And that can be really detrimental to getting steady growth. So, one of the ways to control this is to have certain laws in place, and those are called capital controls. And those laws would simply say if somebody, right, if you're a foreign bank or a foreign investor wants to invest into your country, they have to keep their money in that country for 18 months. If they withdrew the money before that period of time, there will be financial penalty that they have to pay, right? So to encourage countries or investors from not withdrawing their money. That sounds well and good, but there is a negative side to that as well because then sometimes people won't want to invest in the first place, right?